You know that feeling when something's off, but you can't put your finger on it? That's where I found myself a few weeks ago. My wife, Melissa, had been acting strange lately. More glued to her phone, coming home late, and brushing off my questions with flimsy excuses about work projects. At first, I told myself it was just stress from her job. She was always ambitious, climbing the corporate ladder as a senior marketing manager, and I'd admired that about her. But then came the nights when she started going to client dinners that ran past midnight. The mornings when she'd smell faintly of cologne that wasn't mine. The lingering glances she exchanged with her boss, Damien, at company events, which I initially chalked up to professional camaraderie. It was the little things that finally got to me. Her new obsession with lingerie, her sudden fitness kick, the secretive way she locked her phone. I wasn't one to snoop, but curiosity ate at me. Was she just working harder, or was there something or someone else occupying her mind? Then came the text message. It wasn't hers, at least not directly. Came to my phone by mistake. Some glitch in the messaging app we shared. A simple, careless line. Last night was incredible. Same time tomorrow. My stomach sank. I knew who it was from without needing to look further. Her boss, Damien. It wasn't just the text. It was the way the pieces suddenly clicked into place. Her distant affection, her excuses, the way she seemed to light up when he entered a room. I didn't confront her right away. I needed to know for sure. So I started digging. Calls to her colleagues, checking her social media, even following her one night when she worked late. What I found wasn't just proof of an affair. It was a betrayal of everything we'd built together. And now, here I am, waiting for the perfect moment to confront her. She doesn't know that I know. She doesn't know what's coming. But she will. After that fateful text, my nights turned into restless hours of plotting and second-guessing. How do you confront someone you love, someone you've built a life with, about a betrayal you never imagined possible? I needed proof, something undeniable. Words could be twisted, stories fabricated. But cold, hard evidence? That couldn't be denied. I started small. Her phone was always password protected, but she wasn't as cautious with her laptop. One evening, while she was in the shower, I opened it. The screen demanded a password, but after a few tries, I cracked it. Our wedding anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her email was clean, almost too clean, but her calendar was a goldmine. Meetings marked as off-site, with vague details like client discussion or strategic alignment. The next one, a late dinner at a swanky downtown restaurant on Friday. Her boss, Damien, was listed as an attendee. I needed to be sure this wasn't just business. I had to see it with my own eyes. On Friday, I feigned a headache after dinner and told Melissa to go ahead without me. She hesitated briefly, maybe even guiltily, but eventually left, dressed to kill in a black dress that hugged her figure in all the right places. I waited until her car pulled out of the driveway before grabbing my keys and following at a distance. She drove to the Sapphire Lounge, a spot far too upscale for casual client meetings. From my car, I watched her park, step out, and meet Damien near the entrance. His hand lingered on the small of her back as he guided her inside. My blood boiled. I needed more than a sighting. I slipped into the restaurant, keeping to the shadows near the bar. They were seated in a secluded booth, leaning in close. They weren't holding hands or doing anything overt, but the way she smiled at him, laughed at his every word, it was too intimate. Then he reached across the table and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned into his touch. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to fuel my rage. I wanted to storm over, to demand answers, but I wasn't ready to play my hand. Not yet. Instead, I slipped back out and waited by her car. Hours passed before they emerged. Laughing, her arm looped through his. They walked to his car, no, her car, and stood talking. Talking turned into a kiss. A deep, passionate kiss that shattered any lingering doubt I had. My hand clenched the phone in my pocket, recording every second. They didn't even notice me parked just a few feet away. When he finally left, she got into her car, fixing her lipstick in the mirror as if nothing had happened. I followed her home, staying far enough back that she wouldn't suspect. Inside, she greeted me with her usual smile, kissed my cheek, and asked how I was feeling. I wanted to scream, to shove the evidence in her face, but I forced myself to smile back. "I'm fine," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "How was your meeting?" She hesitated for a split second before replying, "Productive. Just a lot of work talk." I nodded, playing the clueless husband one last time.
I'm glad.
In my mind, the pieces of my plan started falling into place. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make sure she never forgot the consequences of betraying me. This was far from over. The next morning, I woke up early, my mind already racing with possibilities. Melissa lay beside me, her breathing steady, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. The sight of her so serene, so unbothered, made my chest tighten. She'd kissed me goodnight after kissing him. The betrayal was suffocating. I had to stay focused. Emotional outbursts wouldn't get me what I needed. I spent the day researching quietly, methodically. I looked into apps that could track her movements and record calls. I even found software that would sync with her phone and log messages without her knowing. Felt dirty, invasive, but so was what she was doing. And I needed everything, the texts, the calls, the photos, the proof. That night, after dinner, she was back on her phone, giggling at something. I forced a laugh, asking, "What's so funny?" She looked up, startled, her thumb hovering over the screen like a guilty child caught with their hand in the cookie jar. "Oh, just a meme from one of the girls at work. Liar." "Let me see," I said, reaching casually for her phone. Her reaction was instant. Too instant. She pulled it away with a forced laugh. "You wouldn't get it. It's girl humor." I shrugged, pretending not to care, and went to get a drink. But her reaction only confirmed what I already knew. She was hiding something. Later that night, while she was in the shower, I made my move. I'd already installed tracking software on her phone earlier in the week. One of those Find My Device apps disguised as a weather widget. It synced to my laptop in the office, where I could view her location, texts, and even live listen to her surroundings. When I opened the app, I saw her recent messages. Most were mundane chats with colleagues and group texts about office work. But then I found his thread. Damien's name was saved as D. Subtle. The messages made my stomach churn. "D, last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you. Melissa, me too. Can't wait for next time." There it was. Black and white. Undeniable proof of their affair. But it got worse. As I scrolled up, I saw plans for next week. They were meeting again. But this time it wasn't just for dinner. She was planning an overnight trip, booked under the guise of a client retreat. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to confront her right then, but I forced myself to wait. Confronting her now would only give her time to spin a story. I needed to corner her, to leave no room for lies. The plan started forming in my head. I'd let her think she was in control, let her feel safe. And then I'd catch her, red-handed, in a way she couldn't deny or explain away. The next morning, I kissed her on the cheek before work, playing my role perfectly. "I hope today's not too stressful," I said, as if I cared. She smiled back, her eyes sparkling with the ease of someone who thought they'd gotten away with everything. "I'm sure it'll be fine." "Fine. Sure." Her car pulled out of the driveway, and I turned to head back inside. I had a lot to prepare. The stage was set, and the clock was ticking. She had no idea what was coming. By midweek, Melissa was slipping deeper into her double life. She was confident, careless even. The sweet little lies came so easily now. Dinner with the team, late meeting, exhausted from work. Every excuse was another thread in her web of deceit. But I wasn't tangled in it. I was watching from the outside, letting her weave her own downfall. Her overnight trip with Damien was just days away. She didn't know I'd seen the hotel reservation email or heard their late-night phone calls through the app. Every sweet nothing Damien whispered, every promise of what they'd do together, made me feel sick. But I held on, knowing I'd turn their lust against them. On Thursday, I planted the seeds. At breakfast, I casually mentioned that I had an upcoming work project that might require me to travel over the weekend. She barely blinked, too busy scrolling through her phone. "That's fine," she said, pouring herself another cup of coffee. "I'll probably just catch up on errands, right?" That evening, I pretended to work late in the office, but I was actually prepping. The spare bedroom became my command center, complete with a laptop, the tracking app, and a backup camera setup. I even tested the equipment to make sure it would capture everything in high quality. If they thought they could get away with this in some seedy hotel, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Friday night arrived, and Melissa was in full work mode. She came home, breezed past me with a peck on the cheek, and went straight upstairs to pack. Through the app, I saw the texts flying between her and Damien. "Melissa, I can't wait. It's been too long." Damien, "Pack light. You won't need much." Winky face. The nerve. I lingered by the door as she came back down with a small suitcase, her face glowing with anticipation. "Don't wait up," she said with a playful smile. "This client dinner might go late." "Oh, I won't," I replied smoothly, my tone as casual as hers. "Have fun." She was gone within minutes, leaving me alone in the house with my thoughts and my plan. Hours later, I arrived at the hotel they'd chosen for their little rendezvous. Parking a few spaces away from Melissa's car, I slipped inside unnoticed, my heart pounding. Thanks to the app, I knew exactly which room they were in. Room 317. I didn't rush. The front desk clerk barely glanced at me as I made my way up the stairs, a small duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The camera, spare batteries, and a small recorder were all inside. I thought of every angle, literally. When I reached their door, I paused, pressing my ear against the wood. Faint laughter filtered through, followed by Damien's unmistakable voice, saying something that made Melissa laugh again. My stomach churned, but I steadied myself. This wasn't the time for emotion. Quietly, I set up the camera outside their window, concealed by a nearby plant. It was risky, but the placement was perfect, giving me a clear view into their room without alerting them. My recorder went under the door, small enough to remain unnoticed. As I stepped back into the shadows, I checked my phone. The app showed her location, still right there, just a few feet away. I waited. Minutes turned into hours, but I stayed. Around midnight, the noises started. Laughter turned into muffled groans, words into breathy gasps. My jaw clenched as I watched through the lens. There they were, tangled together in the bed, so wrapped up in each other that the world outside didn't exist. I hit record. This wasn't just about catching them. It was about making sure there was no way for her to deny what she'd done. No room for excuses. No tears or apologies to soften the blow. When it was over, I slipped back to my car, my stomach in knots. The video, the audio, the photos, I had everything I needed. Tomorrow, Melissa would come home, thinking she'd gotten away with it. She'd kiss me, smile, maybe even tell me she missed me. And then I'd show her what I knew. Tomorrow, the mask would come off. Saturday morning came, and I woke up early, though I hadn't slept much. The events of the night replayed in my mind like a nightmare on loop. Every laugh, every whisper, every touch between Melissa and Damien was burned into my memory. But today wasn't about wallowing in anger, it was about justice. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as I moved around. I brewed a pot of coffee, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The evidence from the night before sat securely on my laptop. I'd watched the footage twice already, each time a dagger to the heart. By mid-morning, Melissa's car pulled into the driveway. I stood by the window, watching as she stepped out, her sunglasses on, hair slightly disheveled. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who thought she'd pulled off the perfect lie. The front door opened, and she walked in, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Hey, babe," she called out, setting her bag down. "Miss me?" The nerve. "Of course," I replied, my voice neutral. I stayed in the kitchen, my back to her, stirring sugar into my coffee. "How was your client dinner?" It was fine, she said, walking in and wrapping her arms around me from behind. Long though. I'm exhausted. I froze at her touch, every muscle in my body tensing. How could she be so casual? So normal? You work too hard, I said, turning to face her. Her expression was warm, affectionate even. It was almost enough to make me second-guess myself. Almost. Want to sit and relax for a bit? I asked, gesturing to the living room. She smiled. That sounds perfect. As she settled onto the couch, I grabbed my laptop from the office and joined her, sitting across the room. I've been working on something, I said, opening the laptop. I'd love your thoughts. Melissa raised an eyebrow but nodded, leaning back. Sure, what is it? I turned the screen toward her, hitting play on the video. At first, she didn't react, her expression blank as the grainy footage showed a hotel room. Then, the figures on the screen became clearer, her and Damien. Her face drained of color. What is this? She stammered, sitting upright. It's you, I said, my voice cold. And Damien. Last night, I followed you, Melissa. I saw everything. She looked at me, her eyes wide, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the words. This isn't... You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. I interrupted, my voice rising. You lied to me, over and over. And for what? Him. Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head. It's not what you think. I didn't mean for it to happen. Stop, I snapped. Don't insult me with excuses. I have everything. The texts, the calls, this video. I gestured toward the screen, where the evidence of her betrayal played on a loop. Do you know what it's like to see the person you love with someone else? To hear the lies while you're sneaking off to be with him? I was going to stop, she whispered, her voice trembling. I swear, I didn't know how to tell you. You didn't know how to tell me? I shouted, standing up. So you just did this instead? You destroyed us, Melissa. For what? Tears streamed down her face, but I felt nothing.
No pity, no compassion.
Just anger. I love you, she said weakly, reaching for me. Don't, I said, stepping back. Don't you dare say that. You don't love me. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. She collapsed into sobs, burying her face in her hands. I watched her for a moment. The woman I'd once thought I'd grow old with, now a stranger. I want you out, I said finally, my voice firm. Pack your things and go. I'll figure out the logistics later. But right now, I can't stand to look at you. Please, she begged, her voice breaking. We can fix this. There's no we anymore. I cut her off. You made sure of that. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving her alone with the mess she'd created. Upstairs, I locked the door to the bedroom and sank onto the bed, my head in my hands. This wasn't how I thought my life would turn out, but at least now I knew the truth. And that was something I could build on, even if it wasn't with her. The hours after our confrontation were a blur. I stayed locked in the bedroom, listening as Melissa's sobs echoed faintly through the house. Part of me wanted to feel something, anything other than the dull ache of betrayal. But I was spent. The storm had passed, leaving behind only silence. By the evening, I ventured downstairs to find Melissa sitting at the kitchen table. Her suitcase was beside her, half-packed. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen. For a moment we just stared at each other, the weight of everything hanging in the air. I don't know where to go, she said softly. Her voice was hoarse, broken. I don't want to leave, but I know you hate me right now. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You should have thought about that before sneaking around behind my back. I made a mistake, she said, her voice cracking. A horrible, stupid mistake. But it didn't mean anything. Damien, it wasn't real. It was just sex. I interrupted, my tone dripping with sarcasm. Yeah, I figured. And that makes it better, right? Just some meaningless fun at the expense of our marriage. She flinched at my words but didn't argue. I love you, she whispered. I love our life together. I don't know why I did it. I was stupid, reckless, and selfish. But I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. There's no fixing this, Melissa. You didn't just hurt me, you shattered my trust, my faith in us. Every time you smiled at me, kissed me, told me you loved me, you were lying. And now you want me to just forget that. I don't expect you to forget, she said, standing. But I'm begging you. Please, don't throw everything away. Don't throw us away. Us, I repeated, incredulous. There hasn't been an us since the moment you decided he was worth risking everything for. She stepped closer, reaching for me, but I stepped back. The distance between us felt insurmountable. Leave, I said finally, my voice flat. Go to a friend's house, a hotel, anywhere but here. I need space. And honestly, so do you. Her face crumpled, and for a second I thought she might argue. But then she nodded, defeated, and grabbed her suitcase. She paused at the door, looking back at me one last time. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely audible. I really am. I didn't reply, couldn't. When the door closed behind her, the house fell silent. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she'd been, trying to process everything. But the hardest part was yet to come. I still had to figure out what to do with the evidence I'd gathered. Not just for my own peace of mind, but for the fallout that would inevitably ripple through her life and Damien's. He wasn't getting away with this either. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. Damien had as much to lose as Melissa, if not more. His position at the company, his reputation, everything was on the line. And I intended to make him feel the full weight of his actions. I started with an email. No threats, no explanations, just a single damning attachment. The video from the hotel. The subject line read, "Let's talk." It wasn't long before my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. "Hello," a frantic voice answered. "Who is this?" I smirked, leaning back in my chair. "You know who this is. You don't understand," Damien stammered. This isn't what it looks like." "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," I said coldly. "And unless you want your boss, your wife, and everyone else in your life to see it, I suggest you meet me. Today." He was silent for a moment, then muttered, "Fine. Where?" I gave him a location, a neutral coffee shop in the next town over, and hung up before he could argue. The wheels were in motion. It was time for Damien to face the consequences of his choices. By the time I arrived at the coffee shop, my adrenaline was spiking. The place was quiet, sparsely filled with a few couples and solo patrons tapping away on laptops. I scanned the room until I spotted him. Damien sat at a corner table, his leg bouncing nervously, his gaze fixed on the untouched coffee in front of him. Good. Let him sweat. I walked over, pulling out the chair across from him. He looked up, his face pale and drawn. "So you're the husband," he said, his voice tight. "And you're the boss," I replied, setting my phone on the table. "Let's skip the small talk. You know why we're here." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I know what this looks like." "What it is, Damien?" I cut him off sharply. "What it is? You're sleeping with my wife. Don't try to sugarcoat it." His mouth opened, but no words came out. I leaned in, lowering my voice but making sure the intensity wasn't lost. "I don't care what excuses you have. I don't care if you think she came on to you or if you think it was mutual. What matters is you crossed a line, and now you're going to deal with the fallout." "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said finally, his voice trembling. "It just got out of hand." "Got out of hand?" I laughed bitterly. "You mean the months of sneaking around, the late-night calls, the hotel rooms? That's not out of hand, Damien. That's deliberate, calculated. And now it's exposed." His face fell, and I could see the weight of my words sinking in. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "Money? To ruin me? What? What I want is for you to feel the same humiliation I felt when I caught you with my wife," I said, leaning back in my chair. "But I'm not unreasonable. You're going to quit your job today. You'll find some excuse, a family emergency, burnout, whatever. But you will resign. and you'll make it clear that Melissa had nothing to do with your decision." He blinked, stunned. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," I said. "And if you don't, that video you've seen? It's going public. Your wife, your boss, your colleagues. They'll all see exactly who you are." "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Try me," I said, my eyes locked on his. I pulled up the video on my phone and hit play. The sound muted, but the images crystal clear. Damien's face went ashen as he watched himself and Melissa on screen. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'll resign." "Good," I said, standing. "And one more thing. If I find out you so much as text her again, I'll make sure that video reaches everyone in your contact list." "Understood." He nodded, his head hanging low. "Understood." Without another word, I walked out, leaving him to stew in the mess he'd made. Back in my car, I exhaled deeply, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Confronting Damien was only part of the battle. Melissa was next. But this time, it wasn't just about punishment. It was about deciding if there was anything left worth saving. That evening, she texted me, asking if we could talk. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the laptop where the video still sat, debating whether to delete it or keep it as a reminder of how far we'd fallen. When Melissa arrived, she walked in cautiously, as if afraid of what she might find. "Can we sit?" she asked, her voice small. "Go ahead," I said, gesturing to the couch. She sat, wringing her hands as she looked at me. "Damien called me," she began. "He said he's resigning. He told me what you did." "And?" I asked coldly. I just want to know what this means for us," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I want to fix this. I want to be with you." "You don't get to decide that, Melissa," I said firmly. "You've already made your choice, over and over again." "But No," I interrupted, my voice rising. "You don't get to plead for forgiveness when you didn't even have the decency to be honest with me. This isn't something we can sweep under the rug." She broke down, sobbing into her hands. I felt no sympathy, only a hollow ache where love used to be. "We're done," I said, standing. "I'll have a lawyer contact you about the next steps. Until then, you can stay here if you need to, but I want nothing to do with you." Her sobs grew louder, but I turned and walked away, my decision made. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than anger, relief. The weight was lifting, and I was finally free. The house was unbearably quiet in the days that followed. Melissa stayed in the guest room, emerging only for meals or to shuffle around like a ghost of the woman I once knew. Every glance she cast my way was filled with regret, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. I had to focus on moving forward, even if my steps were still shaky. On Tuesday, my lawyer, James, called. He'd handled contracts for my business in the past, but this was different. "I've reviewed your situation," he began, his tone professional but edged with sympathy. "Thanks to the prenup, this divorce should be straightforward. Melissa won't have much room to contest the terms." The prenup, a practical precaution at the time, though I'd never believed I'd need it. It stated that in the event of infidelity, the offending party forfeited their right to spousal support and received only a fraction of shared assets. Her father, ironically, had insisted on it. James continued, "We'll file the paperwork this week. Given the evidence you've provided, I don't anticipate any delays." Evidence. That damned video, the texts, the call logs, they were all burned into my memory, yet I couldn't delete them. They were my safety net, my shield against any attempt she might make to rewrite history. "Thanks, James," I said. "Let's get it done." That night, I found Melissa in the living room, staring blankly at the television. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of hope and despair. "Is it official?" she asked softly. "Not yet," I replied, leaning against the doorframe. "But it will be." She nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her voice trembling. "About everything. About us. I know I can't undo what I did, but I still love you, even if you hate me now." "I don't hate you," I said after a moment. I hate what you did. I hate that you made me question everything we had. She wiped at her eyes, silent for a long time. Do you think we could ever get past this? Maybe not now, but someday? I let out a bitter laugh. I don't know, Melissa. I really don't. All I know is that right now I can't trust you. And without trust, there's no relationship. Her tears came harder, but I didn't move to comfort her. Couldn't. The distance between us wasn't just physical. It was a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. The next day, I received an email from Damien. It was short, almost clinical. Subject: my resignation. Message: as agreed, I've tendered my resignation effective immediately. I hope this resolves matters between us. Please respect my family's privacy moving forward. I stared at the message, my anger flaring anew. Respect your family's privacy? The hypocrisy was almost laughable. But I let it go. He wasn't worth my energy anymore. As the days turned into weeks, the initial storm began to settle. Melissa moved out, staying with a friend while we finalized the divorce. The house felt emptier without her, but it was a relief to have space to think, to breathe. Friends and family began to notice the change, though I kept the details vague. We're going through some things, I'd say when pressed. The gossip would inevitably swirl, but I didn't care. My focus was on healing, not on managing appearances. One night, I sat in the office, sifting through old photos on my computer. There we were, smiling at parties, on vacations, at home. Each image was a reminder of the life we'd built, and the lies that had destroyed it. I almost closed the folder when a photo caught my eye. It was from our anniversary last year. Melissa stood in front of a cake, her smile radiant. Damien was in the background, his eyes fixed on her. Even then, there'd been something I hadn't seen. It was a sobering realization. The signs were always there. I just hadn't wanted to see them. The divorce papers were signed a month later. Melissa didn't fight the terms, though her tears fell freely as she handed me the signed documents. I'm sorry, she whispered one last time, her voice breaking. I know, I replied, and I did. But sorry wasn't enough to fix the wreckage. As she left, the weight lifted further. The chapter was closing, and while it wasn't the ending I'd envisioned, it was an ending nonetheless. I wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to hope. The months following the divorce were a whirlwind of adjustments. Friends who had been our friends became mine or hers. Family gatherings became awkward, each relative tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. My house, once filled with laughter, arguments, and shared moments, was now silent. But in that silence, I found clarity. One sunny afternoon, I decided to purge the house of remnants from my marriage. The wedding photos, the anniversary gifts, the souvenirs from trips, all of it went into a box destined for the attic. It was cathartic, like shedding a heavy coat I no longer needed. Yet, as I sorted through the items, I found a small note tucked inside an old book. It was from Melissa, written years ago, back when we were still in love. No matter what happens, you'll always be the love of my life. For a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia. I folded the note carefully and put it back in the book, not because I wanted to keep it, but because some memories, even painful ones, deserve a place in the past. Damien disappeared from my radar entirely. Word got around that he'd moved to another city, taking a lower-ranking job at a rival company. I didn't care. His chapter in my life was closed. Melissa, too, stayed out of my life. We only spoke when necessary, about finalizing financial matters or returning forgotten items. She once sent a long email, pouring out her regret and love, but I didn't reply. What was there to say? Life began to normalize in ways I hadn't expected. I threw myself into work, pouring my energy into projects that reignited my passion. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, finding solace in their support and understanding. I even started going out again. At first, it felt strange, sitting across from someone new, sharing stories, laughing. But over time, it became easier. The idea of moving on no longer felt like betrayal but like survival. One evening, I found myself at a small neighborhood bar, nursing a drink and chatting with the bartender. A woman approached, her smile warm but shy. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, gesturing to the stool beside me. "Not at all," I replied, smiling back. We talked for hours, her laughter infectious, her stories captivating. Her name was Laura, a freelance photographer with a knack for finding beauty in the mundane. There was no pressure, no expectation, just two people enjoying each other's company. For the first time in a long time, I felt a spark. Not the kind that consumes you instantly, but the steady, hopeful kind that builds over time. As I walked home that night, I looked up at the stars, brighter than I'd noticed in months. Life had thrown me a curveball, one that shattered my world. But as I stood there under the night sky, I realized something. The pieces had fallen apart so I could rebuild something stronger, something better. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to try. The past was behind me. The future was mine to create. And maybe, just maybe, I'd found a reason to believe in love again.